In 1905, a man walked into a Wellington street and shot an elderly stranger in cold blood. He didn't run. He didn't hide. The following morning, he walked into a police station, placed his revolver on the front desk, and handed over a copy of his self-published manifesto. The jury found him guilty. The judge sentenced him to death. He was never hanged. Instead, Lionel Terry spent the next 47 years inside New Zealand's asylum system, escaping repeatedly, declaring himself a prophet, and becoming one of the most notorious inmates Seacliff Lunatic Asylum has ever had. So how does a condemned murderer end up spending half a century in a padded cell instead of at the end of a rope? Most people who know the name Lionel Terry know it because of the murder. That's fair. The murder is why he's remembered. But the murder isn't the story. It's the beginning of one. How did an educated Englishman become a racial fanatic? Why did doctors conclude he was insane when his crime looked anything but? How did he keep walking out of locked institutions? And what does it say about the system that contained him that he lived better inside it than most New Zealanders ever lived outside it? By the end of this, we'll have answers. Not comfortable ones, but answers. Lionel Terry was born in England in January 1873 into a comfortable, respectable family. His father was a corn merchant in Kent who claimed descent from Napoleon Bonaparte. Nothing else in his upbringing marked him out as special. He spent years drifting across the British Empire, South Africa, Canada, States, Australia, and eventually here in New Zealand. And somewhere along that road, a set of ideas took hold. By the time he arrived here, Terry had convinced himself that white civilization was under existential threat. It wasn't a passing prejudice. It became the ongoing organising principle of his entire existence. He didn't keep it to himself. He thought he'd discovered something the rest of the world was too blind or too cowardly to see. Which brings us to the next question. What does a man do when he believes he's found a truth that nobody wants to hear? He writes a book. Terry's manifesto was called The Shadow. He believed politicians would read it. He believed newspapers would cover it. He believed ordinary New Zealanders would rally behind it. He was wrong. Nobody cared. So in July 1905, he took matters into his own hands, walking nearly 900 miles from Monganui to Wellington, distributing copies as he went. At every stop, he lectured anyone who'd stand still long enough to hear. He was physically impressive, well-spoken, and completely convinced he was right. People found him striking. Some found him compelling. None of them believed him, and none of them changed anything. The more he was ignored, the more certain he became that he was right, that the world's silence was proof of how thoroughly it had been deceived. He stopped thinking of himself as a man with an opinion. He was a man with a mission. And missions, when they stall, have a way of radicalizing their carrier. So what happens when a man on a mission runs out of patience? Before we get to what Lionel Terry did, it's worth pausing on who he did it to. Joe Kum Yung was in his late 60s. He'd come to New Zealand as a young man during the gold rush, worked the West Coast fields under conditions that would have broken most people, and suffered a minor injury that left him with permanent limp. He'd spent decades building a life here, quietly, without fanfare, without a manifesto. By 1905, he was a part of the Chinese community on Haining Street in Wellington. He'd earned his place. He'd earned his years. On 24th of September 1905, Lionel Terry walked through Wellington and found him. Terry had never met him. Joe Kum Yung had done nothing to him. But Terry noticed his limp and later told authorities that's why he chose him. It wasn't random. Terry selected a man he considered vulnerable. Then he shot him in the back of the head. Joe Kum Yung died in hospital later that night. The following morning, Terry walked into Lambton Quay Police Station placed the murder weapon on the front desk and said, "I have come to tell you that I am the man who shot the Chinaman in the Chinese quarters of the city last evening. I take an interest in alien immigration, and I took this means of bringing it under the public scrutiny." He handed over copies of The Shadow and suggested they read it if they wanted to understand his position. He wasn't fleeing, he wasn't panicking. He was literally announcing himself. The jury found him guilty. The judge sentenced him to death. But Lionel Terry would never stand beneath the gallows. Which raises the obvious question: why not? Because doctors said he was insane. And here's where the story stops being a straightforward true crime case and starts being something harder to look at directly. Because the question of whether Lionel Terry was mad or simply monstrous would follow him for the next half century, without ever being cleanly resolved. Questions about Terry's mental state emerged almost immediately after his arrest. The combination of his grandiosity, his racial obsession, and the almost theatrical way he committed and announced the murder gave psychiatrists pause. At trial, he conducted his own defense. He told the court he was perfectly aware of what he'd done and why. The Chief Justice told the jury the key question was his mental state. The verdict was guilty, but it came with a strong recommendation for mercy. His death sentence was commuted. Instead of the gallows, he was committed to New Zealand's asylum system. The state had decided Terry was broken in a way that made execution inappropriate. But that answer immediately created a harder one. If he was insane, was the murder really a symptom? Or was it a choice? And if it was a choice, what exactly were they locking away? More than a century later, this is still the question that people argue about. The case for insanity isn't weak. The grandiosity, the messiah complex, the obsessive fixation, these aren't the hallmarks of a balanced mind. He was later formally diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. His behaviour across decades of institutional life would reinforce that picture. But the murder itself was planned. He walked nearly 900 miles building towards it. He chose his location, he selected his victim, he prepared copies of a document to distribute at the scene. That's not impulsive, that is absolutely pre-planned and deliberate. Delusional and dangerous aren't the same thing. A person can believe something false with total conviction and still know exactly what they're doing. Now, Terry may have been both. And while doctors and authorities debated his mind, a more immediate problem was developing. Terry kept escaping. Authorities thought they'd solved the Lionel Terry problem. They hadn't. Once Terry entered the asylum system, he didn't disappear quietly into the background. He became a recurring headline. His first escape came from Sunnyside in September 1906. According to newspaper reports at the time, Terry had been working around the asylum grounds during the day. That evening, the inmates were assembled for tea. Then, when they were about to be locked in for the night, Terry was simply gone. The windows were fastened, the doors were locked, and nobody could explain how he'd got out. Some reports even speculated that he'd had a key or that someone outside had helped him. He was recaptured after a struggle. Then, almost immediately, he escaped again. This time, reports said he'd been locked up in the ordinary way, but got out during rough weather. A howling sou'wester and heavy rain helping cover the escape. He'd even managed to hide asylum trousers and boots in the ground beforehand. That tells you something important. These weren't random dashes for freedom. Terry was thinking, planning, and waiting. And the institutions holding him were struggling to stay ahead. Then came Seacliff. In 1907, Terry escaped again, and this time he stayed free for more than 3 weeks. He moved through the backcountry near Wakawaiti. When police finally tracked him down, he reportedly put a barbed wire fence between himself and the officers, admitted who he was, told them he wasn't tired of freedom yet, and ran into the bush. The chase was rough enough that one officer was injured trying to follow him. When Terry was finally captured, it took planning. A police party went out near Bendoran Station. A constable spotted Terry approaching without boots or a hat. When ordered to surrender, Terry refused and bolted for cover. But the police had brought Constable Brian, reportedly one of the fastest runners at the Dunedin police station. Brian chased him down. Terry swung at him, missed, and Brian brought him to the ground. Then, in 1908, Terry escaped from Seacliff again. 4 escapes, 2 institutions. A condemned murderer declared insane, repeatedly walking out of places specifically designed to hold him. And every time he got out, the papers ran it. Every time he was brought back, the papers ran that too. He was becoming a fixture, a recurring character in the national story. In a way that Joe Kum Yung, the man he'd killed, never got to be. Terry understood something the authorities didn't. The system was keeping him alive, and the newspapers were giving him an audience. The more attention he received, the larger he seemed to grow in his own imagination. Then he came under the care of Dr. Frederick Truby King. And here is where this story becomes genuinely weird. After a murder, a death sentence, and 4 escapes, you might expect Lionel Terry's conditions to get harder. They got better. In 1914, Terry was returned to Seacliff, and under Dr. Truby King's management, he was given his own suite. A bedroom, a library, and a dining room. Space to paint, write, garden, and keep animals. Goats and sheep by most accounts. The logic was management, not mercy. Now, Truby King believed that productive activity and a degree of autonomy reduced the volatility of difficult patients. Terry was a problem to be contained, not a man to be punished. But while Terry was being given books and gardens, Joe Kum Yung was still dead. His family had buried him, his community had mourned him, and the man who killed him was painting watercolours. That tension sits at the very centre of this story, and it doesn't resolve neatly. Given time, space, and an audience of captive listeners, Terry reinvented himself. He wrote poetry and religious verse. He declared himself a prophet, a messiah, a superman. Not metaphorically, not poetically. Literally, he grew a long white beard. He wore white robes. He built a mythology around himself inside the walls of an asylum. Whether that's the product of a deteriorating mind or a man whose ego simply expanded to fill the space available, or both, is something you'll have to decide for yourself. What's harder to argue with is the effect. His world got smaller, his sense of himself got bigger, and the institution just kept feeding the arrangement. Until something broke it. In 1940, Terry assaulted a doctor who tried to administer a typhoid inoculation. That was the end of the privileges. The books, the garden, the relative freedom, gone. The final 12 years of his life were spent in solitary confinement. He died at Seacliff on the 20th of August 1952. He was 79 years old. He'd outlasted Truby King, outlasted most of the staff who'd managed him, and outlasted the notoriety that had once put him on the front page. He got what he always wanted. He was remembered. Just not the way he'd imagined. People are still arguing about Lionel Terry. They'll probably keep arguing. Was he insane? Was he evil? The honest answer is that those categories don't sit cleanly side by side, and the historical record doesn't let you off the hook with a simple verdict. But here's what I keep coming back to. Joe Kum Yung came to New Zealand in his 40s. He worked the goldfields in conditions that would have ended most men. He took a serious injury and kept going anyway. He built a life here over 25 years. Not a famous life, not a documented one, just a real, ordinary life. The local Chinese community had raised his fare back to China. He chose to stay. He chose to stay, and then he had no more choices. He didn't get a prophet's mythology, or a doctor's case file, or 47 years of newspaper coverage. He got a grave in Wellington. Well, the man who put him there outlived almost everyone who'd ever known his name. Lionel Terry wanted to be remembered. He is. But the name that deserves to outlast his story, the name that got erased from it almost immediately and has stayed in the margins ever since, is Joe Kum Yung. Terry turned his beliefs into a bullet and handed the consequences to a man who never saw it coming. An elderly man with a limp who had survived harder things than Lionel Terry could ever imagine, and who deserved a great deal more than a footnote in someone else's legend. This has been Southern Static. Stay safe and stay out of the static.